So yeah, my name is Dan Scott. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Washington. I'm also a senior geomorphologist at Watershed Science and Engineering. My background is in fluvial geomorphology. And today I'll be talking about wood in rivers, trying to talk about how using a multi-spatial scale understanding of wood can help us manage the kind of tasks that we have of putting wood back in rivers or retaining wood in rivers. So I want to give a little bit of background first, and let me know if I'm standing in front of this, if I'm blocking anyone's view. But I want to give some background on wood in rivers, mostly to talk about the functions that wood plays in rivers and to motivate why we might be restoring wood back into rivers. So wood regulates sediment transport. It drives flow over the banks, which can also deliver nutrients to riparian areas and floodplains. It regulates the form of rivers, so it regulates lateral migration, things like avulsion. It also provides cover for fish, nutrients for macroinvertebrates, and due to all these functions, especially the fact that it regulates lateral migration, it can regulate spatial heterogeneity in rivers. So it can create sort of the foundation for a diverse ecosystem in river valley bottoms. And it has these really important geomorphic, hydrologic, and ecologic functions that it provides for river valley bottoms. So I would argue that we should all care about wood in rivers. The rivers that we see today I'll make the argument that they don't have quite enough wood in them. This is likely what rivers in the Pacific Northwest looked like maybe 100, 200 years ago before we started pulling wood out of them. Rivers that tended to be multi-thread, I know this is kind of hard to see, but with big wood jams with hundreds of logs spanning tens or hundreds of meters. Rivers today like this, drastically simplified, much less wood, probably a coarser bed substrate, which is somewhat worse for fish, less cover, less nutrients, likely reinforced banks so it can't migrate. Really, wood isn't here, but it also would have a very hard time providing the essential functions that it normally does for riverine ecosystems. So widespread wood removal, whether that was for misconceptions about fish passage or navigation, or just trying to make rivers safer to develop around, has greatly simplified rivers, not just in the Pacific Northwest, but also globally. So there's a broad effort to restore wood to rivers and restore the valley bottom habitat that wood usually provides. So the solution to all this, which I've already kind of given away, is to put wood back in rivers. Now it seems pretty simple. We've taken it out over the last 200 years. The natural solution is to put it back. I would argue that that's true, but there's some nuance to it. Placing wood in rivers is dangerous. There's a reason why we took it out in the first place, mainly because it can pose a lot of risks to the things that we like to build in and around rivers. It can float downstream, clog on bridges, cause structural damage, cause flooding on roads and in property. It's a natural hazard to river users like anglers and boaters. And of course, it can create this really undesired vertical and lateral morphologic change in rivers that can threaten the property that we tend to have around rivers. So the question then becomes, how can we not just put wood back in rivers, but how can we balance the risks and benefits of wood in rivers? So I'm going to focus this talk on answering this question by talking about three important scales of wood dynamics. Starting at the watershed scale, I'm going to talk about a concept known as the wood regime, which might sound similar to the flow regime or the sediment regime of a river. I'm going to tell a story about some restoration on a small creek out in the Olympic Peninsula to illustrate how watershed scale wood dynamics relate to reach scale wood dynamics, reach scale being the scale that we tend to do a lot of the engineering and management that we tend to use wood for. So I'm going to use that to transition to a presentation on some work that I've done thinking about the amount of wood or the wood load that is sustainable in a reach of a river. And I'm going to talk about how multi-scale processes happening at the watershed scale as well as at the reach scale of a river regulate the amount of wood that can sort of naturally or sustainably be in a river system. And then I'm going to zoom in even further and talk about wood jam dynamics. So a wood jam is just an accumulation of a bunch of logs in a river. It's sort of the unit by which wood interacts with the river system. And wood jams are these really dynamic and complex things in rivers, but they're really fundamental to the way we like to both restore rivers and to the kind of character of rivers that we're trying to sort of imitate with wood restoration. So I'm going to introduce a tool that I've developed to measure, monitor, and understand wood jam dynamics, and then share some insights that we've gained from using that tool. All right. So starting with the watershed scale, this broad scale, talking about the wood regime, I won't go into this too much, but I'll note that we recently, myself and a bunch of co-authors recently published a paper on this. I invite you to check it out. I'm happy to send it to anyone here, but it goes into a lot more detail than I'll present here, but I'll use this sort of basic conceptual diagram of a watershed to talk about the three wood dynamics processes that really define the wood regime for a watershed. So the first is wood recruitment. Basically, a river can't just mine wood out of its bed the way it would mine sediment out of rock. Wood has to come in from the banks in the riparian area or from uplands in the form of landslides or tree throws, something like that. After it enters the river, it has to move downstream via wood transport mechanisms, either floating, rolling along the bed, sort of like sediment. Of course, sediment doesn't tend to float in a river, so we have to think of this a little bit differently. But as it's being transported downstream, not only can it stop into the river and create obstructions or jams, stuff that we might be interested in managing, it also breaks down through time. So unlike the normal sediment management, we normally have to think about things like sediment attrition, sediment breaking down. Wood can literally leave the watershed in the form of gas as it's respired by microbes. So it's a fundamentally different part of the river system than sediment, but there are a lot of sort of analogies that we can draw between the two. So I won't go into this much further talking about the wood regime, but I will use this case study that I've been working on a creek called Hurst Creek out in the Olympic Peninsula to talk about why it's really important to use the wood regime as sort of a broad-scale paradigm for managing wood in rivers. So Hurst Creek is a small tributary to the Clearwater out on the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington. The reach that I'll be talking about is right near the confluence with the Clearwater, so it's sort of the lowest reach of Hurst Creek. And a little background on Hurst Creek, I want to note that the upstream watershed has been really intensively logged over the past 100 years. So almost all of the uplands have been clear-cut. Sorry, this is a little hard to see. There's been a little bit of riparian buffers left around the streams. They look sort of like this. They're really just alders. They're not quite at the distance we would normally prescribe for riparian buffers. In addition to all that logging, when folks were logging Hurst Creek in the early 1900s, they thought it would be a good idea to truck logs out via the stream channel. And I don't mean log floating, I literally mean driving trucks up and down this. So they cleaned out all the boulders, all the wood, everything that normally obstructed the flow in the channel that caused sediment deposition. And this, along with all the clear cutting in the upstream basin, caused problems with the flow regime, the sediment regime, and the wood regime in Hurst Creek. And I'll go over those to motivate why Hurst Creek is a target for restoration. So on the side of the flow regime, there's a substantial problem in terms of a lack of hydrologic connectivity. So formerly, Hurst Creek has a floodplain and a riparian zone. Water likely went over the banks, delivering nutrients to that riparian zone. Hurst Creek likely migrated from side to side. It recruited trees from its banks. Nowadays, because it's been sized so much that it's been cleaned out, it doesn't do any of that. Basically, water is transported straight down this single thread, very simplified channel. And as a result of that, because the water has no room to spread out, it has more flow energy, it transports more sediment. That's produced a sediment problem in that there are much fewer areas for salmon to spawn. There's practically no gravel or sand in this watershed, or at least in the lower reaches of this watershed. It's incised all the way down to bedrock, which you can kind of see on the right side of this photograph. And I would argue that both of those problems are sort of a result of the wood problem in Hurst Creek, which is mainly that there's no cover for fish and there is no obstruction to flow that would normally cause sediment deposition, would normally drive flow over bank. There's no wood in Hurst Creek to serve these important functions. So the restoration action in Hurst Creek was naturally put the wood back in. So this is a drone photograph of the upstream part of the restoration site that I've been working on. This is 3 years post-construction, and that is a large channel-spanning jam, not anchored to the bed, so it's not the kind of typical pile-driven large rock ballasted jam that you might see in larger rivers. This one is started out as just a few logs tied together with manila rope. Some alders fell on top of it. It recruited a little bit of wood, and importantly, it started to block the entire channel. And in fact, all 6 of the engineered log jams, or ELJs, that were put on this creek spanned the entire channel, blocked it up, caused a large backwater, drove flow over the banks, created side channels. Because they slowed flow down so much, they caused a bunch of sediment deposition. So what we were seeing 3 years post-restoration was a much improved condition for Hearst Creek. There had been literally feet of sediment aggradation, bringing it almost back up to its historic floodplain. The sediment in the creek was fine. Fish could spawn there. Fish had cover. This was awesome. Until a flood just a few months ago. I fortunately went out here just a few weeks before a large flood in late December. I took this picture. This is the same jam that I was just showing before, and I've highlighted some trees here with those yellow arrows, because I'll show another photo taken from this almost position showing these jams after the flood. This is basically what happened to Hearst Creek. There was a large flood, pretty typical that it had been sort of sustaining over the past few years, not exceptionally large by any means, but large enough to blow out all 6 of the ELJs placed on Hearst Creek. Almost all of the wood that was placed in this creek, you can see there's a little bit on the sides. That's also kind of started to wash downstream now. So what happened? It incised back down to bedrock. It transported out all of that fine sediment that this restoration was capturing. There was no more floodplain connectivity, no more side channel connectivity, no more of this fine sediment for fish, and of course much less wood. So by and large, Hearst Creek was pretty much reset back to its pre-restoration condition. Not great. So the question for me, and the reason that I've been working on this project, is why did the jams in Hearst Creek mobilize? Why did this project essentially revert back to pre-restoration condition? So we can use the wood regime and some concepts that I'll also discuss later on in this talk to start to answer this question. Hearst Creek, the way I think about its hydrology is that there's a lack of water interception on the hillsides. So if you think about it, you clear-cut forests to the point where there are no trees, very little understory. There's nothing to keep water from running immediately into the stream channel. You already have a channel that is sort of adjusted to the flashy flows that we tend to get on the west side of the Opix, but you basically turn this into a channel that gets even flashier flows when it rains, turning it into the way I kind of think about it is like a giant water cannon. It has no ability to retain water on the hillsides, nothing to retain water in the channel, so every time it rains, it experiences a pretty intense flood. And these jams span the channel. Not only do they span the channel, but they became relatively impermeable due to some of the slash that was attached to them during construction, as well as the recruitment of fine wood after construction. Because they were impermeable, they kind of acted as cannonballs in the cannon that was Hearst Creek. So every time it flooded, these jams had to take the full force of the flow energy going down Hearst Creek. There was no significant side channel development that would have dissipated that flow energy. And on top of that, these jams, due to project restrictions and some habitat restrictions in the area, were built with alders and small trees that, to be sustained through time, really needed a fresh supply of ideally sort of medium to large conifers that are a little bit more decay resistant coming in from upstream. Because there was all that logging in the upstream basin, because the riparian buffers were insufficient, and most notably because Hearst Creek doesn't migrate laterally and recruit trees upstream of this reach, there really wasn't enough large wood coming in from upstream to sustain these jams. So we can summarize this by saying that those ELJs and in general the amount of wood that was reintroduced to Hearst Creek was not sustainable under Hearst Creek's wood regime. So what could we do next time to kind of use the concept of wood dynamics to maybe prepare a little bit better for restoring wood to Hearst Creek? as well as other tributaries, in the Clearwater Basin. I would argue that we need to consider two things. First, we need to consider controls on wood load, controls on on how much wood a river can actually hold in any given reach. So in Hearst Creek, there was too much wood introduced given the wood supply. Basically, just like sediment, if you dump a bunch of sediment in a reach and there's no sediment coming in from upstream to sustain it, it's all going to wash downstream. Same thing with wood. These jams were built with fast decaying wood, and they didn't even have enough of that to sustain them. In addition, I would argue that we need to zoom in on each individual jam and try to predict, or at least in this case, sort of hindcast, why those jams mobilized. So why didn't they just, lose a few pieces and turn into maybe a different morphology of jam? Why did they kind of wholesale blow out and transport down this creek? So these two things will form the next two parts of this talk. And I'll start with a discussion of reach-scale wood load. So this is going to be presenting some work I did just a couple of years ago, published now in Water Resources Research. I'm going to really focus here on kind of broad-scale results. So if you're interested in all the modeling and sort of numerical stuff we did, I invite you to check out that paper. But what we were doing is trying to figure out whether wood and the amount of wood in a creek varies systematically throughout a watershed. And the reason I phrased this question this way is because a lot of previous work has sort of come to the understanding that the amount of wood in any given basin sort of is a site-specific thing. A lot of previous papers concluded that you can't really predict wood loads based on deterministic factors. You have to go to every individual basin, understand everything about it, and really measure its wood load all over the place, as opposed to using sort of deterministic process-based predictors to understand how much wood is in any given point in a basin. So we set out to figure out, can we, instead of doing this on sort of a basin-by-basin approach, can we look across multiple watersheds and use data from multiple watersheds to understand the relevant processes that regulate wood load? So I went out in the field. I conducted a lot of field observations, mainly measuring wood load across 4 basins that I'll show on the next slide. Measured valley bottom characteristics, like the morphology and shape of these valley bottoms, as well as forest stand characteristics, thinking about the fact that all the wood coming into these valley bottoms comes from the upland forest. Then I applied some statistical methods to figure out how wood load varies from place to place throughout a river network. So I want to talk a little bit about where I did this work, because this really sets up what we were able to gain from it. So these are 4 basins across the western U.S. I'll start up here with the Big Sandy. This is a basin in the Rockies in the Wind River Range. It's semi-arid, it's very dry, the forests are sparse. That lies in stark contrast to the Middle Fork Snoqualmie River here near Seattle. This is in the Cascades. It's very wet, much denser, sort of temperate rainforest. Then I also worked on 2 basins out on the Olympic Peninsula, the Sitcombe and the South Fork Kalawa. Again, very wet, very dense forests. So the reason I'm talking about climate here is because I'm setting up the first hypothesis that went into this research, which is that these wetter basins that tend to have much denser upland forests should tend to store more wood along their river networks. So I know this is hard to see, but that picture over there is a picture from the Middle Fork Snoqualmie, showing the kind of typical temperate rainforest that we tend to see here in the Northwest. The picture on the left is from the Big Sandy. One thing I want to highlight are these big grassy open patches near the streams. This is a parkland ecosystem similar to what we might find on the east slopes of the Cascades. Much sparser forests and likely much less wood being delivered to streams. So I also want to zoom in on these 2 basins. I used these basins in the Olympics as sort of a paired basin study. So these 2 basins are almost identical in every way. They have very similar network topology, similar relief structures, similar lithology, similar climate. At least before the forests were disturbed, they had almost identical vegetation characteristics. Until sometime in the late 1800s, when folks started clear-cutting in this northern basin, the Sitcombe. It lies just outside of Olympic National Park, and that orange overlay that you can see shows where the Forest Service thinks people have logged, which is a sort of drastic underestimate of where logging actually has been in this basin. To the south is the South Fork Kalawa River. This is in Olympic National Park. It's seen almost no disturbance or development, at least direct disturbance, since European settlement of this area. So no roads, no logging, no towns, nothing. Really just a trail running from north to south in this basin. So I use these basins to test the hypothesis that logging reduces wood load. This should be sort of pretty obvious, but looking at these basins, I saw the opportunity to do this really nice paired basin study and really nail down what happens to wood load in a river when you clear-cut the upland forests. So I'm going to present a little bit of data here. These plots show wood load on the y-axis, which is how much wood is in a given reach of the stream, and then the 4 basins on the x-axis. Looking first at a comparison between these 2 basins in the Olympics, we found a factor of 2 difference between the logged basin and the unlogged basin. And again, these basins are similar in almost every other way, so I would strongly argue that this is sort of the isolated effect of logging in these 2 basins. Then, shifting over to, again, this basin in the Cascades, the Middle Fork Snoqualmie, and a basin in the Rockies, the Big Sandy. If we transition from a wet temperate rainforest to a much drier parkland ecosystem, we see a 2 order of magnitude difference in wood load. So as a sort of first cut, I would argue that within a basin, if you know something about the forest stand density or even just the climate and the anthropogenic influences on the upstream watershed, that should tell you something about how much wood is able to make it into rivers and able to sustain the wood supply in those rivers. Okay, so getting into a little bit more interesting stuff, I wanted to dive in on this project to local controls on wood load, thinking about if you look at a reach, what about that reach makes it store a lot of wood or not store a lot of wood. So I'm going to summarize some results from a few papers and some statistical modeling we did without going too much into the math. We found that reaches that contained wood jams, so these accumulations of wood, tend to store more wood. Now this sounds very cyclical. Of course, if you see a bunch of piles of wood in a reach, you're going to store a lot of wood. What I would argue here is that wood jams are these sustainable, sort of long-lived features that not only store a lot of wood, but also trap wood within a reach. They act as roughness elements that trap wood. We also found that confined streams tend to store a lot more wood than unconfined streams. I like to use this picture to illustrate that. So if you think of this stream with valley walls very close to the active channel, you see a lot of these elements like large pieces of like intact tree or logs that have fallen across the channel that act as roughness elements for wood to rack up on as it's being transported down this creek. So you tend to find a lot higher wood loads in creeks that look sort of like this, compared to creeks that look more like this, where wood tends to deposit on gravel bars or unvegetated parts of the floodplain, where it can, as soon as the flow rises again, wood can just float right downstream. And then finally, higher gradient streams that contain features like steps and pools, a little bit more vertical complexity in their channel beds, tended to store a little bit more wood, again because there are these features that wood can rack up on and accumulate. So I want to summarize this a little bit, at least the last 2 observations, with this idea that more spatially heterogeneous reaches tend to store more wood. Reaches with more complexity in terms of the large immobile elements that likely won't move downstream during the next flood tend to rack up and store a little bit more wood than reaches without those elements. Similarly, if we think about this in plan form view, this is coming from a different study we did. If you think about a river with features like this, so large vegetated islands, side channels, multiple flow paths across the valley bottom, this reach has a lot more potential to trap wood moving downstream and store large amounts of wood than a reach like this. So this would be something like Hurst Creek, completely straight, no in-channel, large sort of plan form roughness elements for wood to rack up on. And as a result, we observed much lower wood loads in reaches like this. So I also want to go back to that other observation that we made, and I'll argue that there is sort of a positive feedback whereby you start to accumulate wood jams in streams, and those wood jams start to then accumulate more and more wood as they remain stable. So individual pieces of wood like this, or dispersed logs, tend to not be very stable in streams compared to things like this, or accumulations of logs. Once wood starts to accumulate in jams, it starts to trap more wood. Jams might last anywhere from a few years to a few centuries in some places. And as a result, sort of the more jams you have in a given reach, those jams tend to slow down flow energy, disperse flow into the overbank, as well as trap wood. So they reduce the flow energy, able to transport wood, and they act as trapping structures themselves. So I'll summarize all this stuff with this conceptual model, which might seem a little obvious, at least from the start, but I really find this to be useful in thinking about if you look at a given reach anywhere in a watershed, how can we kind of nail down the factors that will regulate the amount of wood that's naturally sustainable in that reach. So first things first, of course, wood supply matters. If you have a completely unforested catchment, you shouldn't expect to see any wood in the river. Similarly, if you don't leave riparian buffers after you clear cut a river, you shouldn't expect to see any wood. But of course, no matter how much wood is being dumped into a river, you need something in the channel to trap that wood. And I refer to that as trapping, the reach scale trapping efficiency, which, based on some modeling I've done, I would suggest is a function of two things. First, storage pattern. So whether wood is tending to be stored as individual logs or as wood jams. And as I said previously, wood jams tend to act as a sort of positive feedback, storing more wood. As well as this sort of admittedly nebulous term, spatial heterogeneity, which I use to refer to basically the presence of immobile or slightly less mobile roughness elements in a reach that can trap wood. So this sort of goes along with some previous work looking at wood loads, but the important note that I would make about this is that it applies sort of generally in any watershed because it uses sort of a multi-scale approach to think about wood load. So as opposed to just thinking about, say, broad-scale things like climate and forest stand characteristics or disturbance to forest, it takes into account how wood supply and the amount of wood making it to the stream is sort of filtered through the lens of trapping efficiency, or how well that reach can trap wood, which then regulates wood load. So if we think about this applied to Hearst Creek, how can we use this to better understand or learn some lessons about what happened at Hearst Creek? So first, there was an insufficient wood supply for the jams that were restored to Hearst Creek. There wasn't enough wood coming in from upstream to sustain those jams. Second, there was insufficient spatial heterogeneity. If the creek had been perhaps multi-thread or previously connected to its floodplain, it might have been that, maybe one or two jams flows out, but they rack on other jams downstream, or they might deposit in side channels or something like that. Instead, because Hearst Creek was this sort of water cannon of a straight simplified channel, as soon as wood starts to mobilize in Hearst Creek, there's nothing to catch it. It goes all the way down to the Clearwater and possibly all the way out to the coast. So the question then becomes, could we have used this sort of conceptual model to just predict what would have happened in Hearst Creek? Hindsight is 20/20. Do we accept that we could use this to say that, clearly the restoration in Hearst Creek was insufficient? I would argue we can't. We need to know a little bit more. We need to go one step further, zooming in on those individual ELJs in Hearst Creek to think about why did those engineered log jams mobilize as opposed to experiencing some other form of change during this high flow. So I'm going to transition to presenting on some work that I'm currently doing on wood jam dynamics, thinking about how wood jams change through time in rivers. So I like to use this conceptual diagram to talk about this. So this is a wood jam, and these arrows sort of summarize all the possible ways that this wood jam can change. And the things we need to sort of take into account when we put wood jams in rivers. Wood jams can accumulate wood from upstream, they can rack wood, they can lose individual pieces, letting those pieces potentially mobilize downstream. They can expand and contract, changing their porosity and permeability, and hence their interaction with the flow. And of course, they can mobilize downstream. So I like this figure because I drew it, but it's I think, much more clear to show this in a time-lapse video. This is a jam just out here on the South Fork Snoqualmie River. And you'll see it over the course of a bunch of high flows start to accumulate wood. The porosity of this jam, or its ability to let water through it, its permeability, will decrease through time as it starts to rack more wood, and then during a high flow it will sort of partially mobilize and rotate downstream. In doing so, in adjusting its characteristics to those high flows, it also scoured this backwater pool, deposited a bunch of fine sediment, in essence changing the channel around it. So this is a really complex structure. We have to think about not only how this jam changes in response to the hydraulics around it, but also how that in turn changes the channel bed, which then feeds back on the hydraulics, which then feeds back on wood jam dynamics. So this is a really complicated system, and you might argue that when we put wood in rivers, we tend to use structures that are static, that won't move downstream, and I would totally admit that, yeah, if you send piles 50 feet down into alluvium and put giant rocks on top of a wood jam, it's probably going to be static. Whether that will fix the restoration problem is a completely different matter. But one thing that we have to account for is the fact that restoration more and more is using what I call natural analog wood jams to restore rivers. So jams that maybe they're buried in a little bit of alluvium, maybe they're tied together with manila rope like the ones on Hearst Creek, but they're not securely anchored to the bed. They're not unable to change. So if we're restoring these sort of dynamic, potentially mobilizable wood jams to streams, so this is a creek in Oregon where all this brown stuff is wood, it's a massive restoration reach, and all of that wood is mobile. It's not anchored to the bed. So the major worry here, this is just upstream of the McKenzie River, major watershed in Oregon that a bunch of people live on. So the major worry here is that after restoring this creek, all of this wood is going to just wholesale mobilize downstream, similar to Hearst Creek, racking up on bridges, causing flooding, stuff like that. So this brings me back to that point I made earlier in the talk, that we need to balance the risks and benefits of putting wood in rivers. We can't just put wood in rivers and expect it to do what we want, especially if we're not securely anchoring it to the bed. So the question then becomes, how can we predict if these unanchored jams will mobilize downstream? So I want to go over our current tools that we can use to do this. The first, and I would argue sort of the most thorough, would be force and moment analysis. So thinking about a jam, figuring out the density, the dimensions of every single key piece in that jam, every single log that holds it together, estimating the hydraulic forces acting on these logs, doing some hydraulic modeling, and then trying to predict, under what flow conditions will these logs mobilize downstream. Now this is great, especially for individual logs, but it really starts to get difficult when you're working with jams with hundreds or thousands of logs, or where you can't just cut the jam open or refer back to a CAD design to figure out the dimensions of the logs, stuff like that. In addition, this kind of analysis does not account for things like, okay, what if we start growing vegetation on top of this jam? We have roots in this structure. What if the jam during the first high flow in this project rearranges itself a little bit? This sort of analysis starts to very quickly break down. And it's really impractical for a lot of natural analog wood jams that we restored in rivers. So what we've relied upon up to this point is really expert judgment, using some limited published work and some knowledge about pluvial processes to say, okay, yeah, I think if we bury this jam, say this many feet deep, or if we tie these logs together with rope, I think that's going to be enough. That'll hold it together for X number of years under X flow conditions. And this expert judgment just really isn't satisfying. It's not data driven. We don't get quantitative predictions about how a jam will change. So what I've tried to develop is a tool to get us around that, to get quantitative predictions of how wood jams change through time, as well as better develop our understanding of how these wood jams change. So I've created something called the WooDDAM Dynamics Database and Assessment Model, which I'll refer to by its abbreviation WooDDAM. And it consists of 3 parts. First is a field protocol. We've tried to figure out ways to go out and measure even very complex log rafts like this, jams that are 12, 20 feet deep that you could never see into the middle of. We've tried to figure out a way to go out in the field and assess these jams to basically measure the key characteristics that we think are relevant for wood jam dynamics. And I like to use this figure to summarize those characteristics. So there's things like what parts of the valley bottom do the key pieces in the jam interact with? So the floodplain versus the banks or the bed. Do those key pieces extend above bank full depth? In which case we wouldn't expect them to just float downstream during the next low flow. Now these characteristics might seem very simple and sort of elementary on their own, but I would argue that taken together, we have about 30 of these characteristics in this field protocol. They give you a really comprehensive and holistically relevant idea of wood jam characteristics. So they allow us to capture the essential things about a wood jam that we can reproducibly measure and assess in the field without, taking a chainsaw to these things, which would be kind of counterproductive. The other reason I've talked about reproducibility is because I would argue that wood jams are so complex and so dynamic that a single research team or a single management agency couldn't go out and collect enough data on wood jams and enough data to describe their dynamics to really build a comprehensive understanding of how wood jams change through time. So the whole idea with WooDDAM is that we've introduced this way of measuring jams that almost anyone with a basic river science background can do, and then they can collect this data, they can go out, survey jams, understand the characteristics, go back after high flows and measure how jams have changed, again using these very simple and sort of cheap to measure characteristics, and then they can submit that data to an online public database. Now, this database collects information about wood jam characteristics and dynamics, and it feeds these machine learning statistical models that can predict how wood jam will change through time. Basically, trying to tell us if we know what a wood jam looks like, what is the probability of that jam, say, mobilizing downstream during the next bankful flow, or accumulating wood, assuming there's some sort of wood supply from upstream. So this whole framework, WooDDAM, sort of represents a hypothesis, which is that if we get a bunch of people out measuring wood jam characteristics, measuring wood jam dynamics, say, for instance, after a company reintroduces wood to a river and they need to monitor wood for some period of time, they could use WooDDAM to collect that data and share it in this public database. As this database grows, we start to describe more variability about these wood jams and eventually get to the point where we can use this rich database to develop robust statistical models that allow us to make management-focused decisions about how to design wood jams and streams, whether we should retain naturally deposited wood jams in reaches that we're actively restoring, and alongside that, start to develop our understanding of wood jam dynamics. So start to really understand what processes are relevant in determining how a wood jam will change through time. So alone, this tool is effective for monitoring. I and my co-authors and collaborators have used this to survey 351 jams, or at least do repeat surveys on those jams. I'm working on another 320-ish this summer. I'm actually leaving tomorrow to do about 120 of those. And then already in the database, we've got about 400 unique wood jams that we've described their characteristics and are starting to look at their dynamics. We've applied this to rivers ranging from tiny little steep mountain streams to huge lowland rivers. So we've done a lot of work to show that WooDDAM can work for monitoring wood jams through time and understanding their characteristics. But on the sort of interesting side, we've also started to look into some hypotheses about wood jam dynamics. So the primary hypothesis that we've been looking at is that wood jam dynamics are a sort of complex function of the structure of a jam, so things like its porosity and permeability, its shape, its geometry, its interactions with the valley bottom, so whether it's, say, pinned on a large boulder or, just sitting in the middle of the fallway, and the hydrology or the hydrologic regime that jam experiences on a yearly basis. So I want to share some insights that we've been able to glean so far from this database, thinking about what controls wood jam mobility. So thinking back to Hearst Creek, what made those jams mobilize downstream? So of the resurveys we currently have in the database, only about 10% of them have mobilized. So we've seen a very low rate of mobilization so far. Of course, you might have anecdotal evidence that number is likely higher. But the nice thing about WooDDAM is that this is not sort of a closed case in terms of research. This is an active, open database that anyone can contribute to. So if you disagree with me on any of this stuff, I invite you to submit data and prove me wrong. But right now, what WooDDAM is showing is that we've found sort of a threshold for jam mobility, whereby we tend not to see jams mobilizing at below bankful flows, sort of as you'd expect. But importantly, as the flow overtops the banks, that certainly does not guarantee jam mobility. Even jams that are just sitting in the middle of a channel, if they're, say, buried under a little bit of sediment, or if they have some anchoring from roots into the bank, they can resist pretty powerful, substantial high flows. Now, we've done a little bit of preliminary modeling using this database, doing some statistics, and we figured out that given the jams we currently have in the database, having in situ pieces, so key pieces that are still anchored to the bank by their roots, as well as being in a complex plan form, so something like an anastomosing stream as opposed to a straight stream, tends to increase jam stability. And I want to illustrate that with a jam that has been constructed on Deer Creek. This is in Oregon as a part of a larger restoration, but this jam here, you can see all the white sun-bleached wood, was pre-existing before restoration, and the restoration action here was to tip in a large conifer over this jam, keeping it anchored to the valley wall with its roots, as well as remove some berms on the side of this channel to sort of open it up, allow flow to spread across the floodplain and reduce flow energy. So pretty much anyone who studies wood jams or does this kind of restoration would tell you, if you dump some giant conifer on top of a pile of wood and you spread out the flow that might mobilize it, you're of course going to decrease the likelihood of it mobilizing. The interesting thing that we can do with WooDDAM is we can actually use these machine learning models to quantify that effect. And if we do that right now, I'll note that this is very preliminary, but that specific restoration action on that jam decreased the chances of this jam mobilizing from around 63% down to 7%, given a flow above bank full depth. So that's a pretty substantial decrease in mobilization likelihood. And the nice thing about WooDDAM is that we can actually assign numbers to this. I'm not just saying, as a fluvial geomorphologist, I think this is how things work. This is a sort of data-driven solution to understanding these things. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. I want to summarize the things I've talked about. Starting out with the wood regime, thinking about how wood recruitment, transport, and storage all sort of work together to determine reach-scale wood loads. You'll remember I introduced that conceptual model, thinking about how the amount of wood delivered to a river is filtered through the ability of that river to trap that wood and accumulate wood through time. And then I zoomed in even further to think about wood jam dynamics, introducing WooDDAM and this idea that we can use a collaborative approach to quantifying, understanding, and then predicting wood jam dynamics. All right, so I'll wrap up here, but I want to give some acknowledgments first. So a lot of this work was funded by NSF, the U.S. Forest Service, as well as the Colorado Water Institute and the National Geographic Society. I don't do this alone. I've worked with Brian Collins at the University of Washington, Ellen Wohl at Colorado State University, as well as some folks working for the Forest Service, Steve Yoakum and Becky Flitcroft. I've, of course, got a lot of field assistance, mainly from Ellen Doherty, and access to land for a lot of these projects from the Nature Conservancy and Olympic National Park. So I'd like to thank all those folks, and I'd be happy to take questions. So thank you very much for your attention.